A sunny afternoon in Atlanta turned into chaos when gunshots echoed outside the public library. 15-year-old Elena Brooks, a deaf black teenager, fell to the ground, her blue dress blooming red. All she had done was reach for her tablet,
Elena.
a tool she
Sir,
used to
please
bridge the
remain calm.
silence of
Elena.
her world. In seconds, her life was forever changed.
Elena.
What would you do
Sir,
if
please
this
remain
was your
calm.
daughter?
Elena.
If a single misunderstanding could erase her future? Before we uncover how one father used his skills to bring down an entire corrupt precinct, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if stories of justice, courage, and truth matter to you, hit that like button and subscribe so together we can shine a light on the stories others try to silence. On a bright afternoon in downtown Atlanta, the streets around the public library were filled with the ordinary hum of life. Children were leaving after school. Parents were rushing between errands, and a gentle breeze rustled the magnolia trees that lined the sidewalks. Nothing about that day hinted at tragedy until the sharp crack of gunfire shattered the air. Within moments, the scene that unfolded on the wide marble steps of the library would capture the attention of an entire city. 15-year-old Elena Brooks lay motionless, her blue summer dress darkening with spreading crimson. The silence that followed was broken only by gasps, screams, and the distant wail of sirens drawing closer. Elena was not a name known to the city before that day. To those who knew her best, she was bright, curious, and relentless in her drive to solve problems. Born deaf, she learned from an early age that the world was not designed for her, but rather than retreat, she chose to fight back with her mind and creativity. Elena had been developing a program, an app she called BridgeCom, that would allow deaf individuals to interact more safely with police officers during stops and emergencies. She believed with the confidence only youth can muster that a simple piece of technology could save lives. Ironically, it was the very device she carried to showcase her project that led to the fatal misunderstanding. That afternoon, Elena had just finished coding a new feature and was eager to meet with her mentor at the library's computer lab. Her tablet, covered in stickers of science icons and musical notes, was tucked under her arm as she walked past a grocery stand where an elderly white man struggled with a torn paper bag. Without hesitation, she bent down to help gather his scattered apples and canned goods. This small act of kindness was seen differently from across the street. Officer Brent Carver, a 6-year veteran of the Atlanta Police Department, sat idling in his patrol car at the corner. Through the lens of suspicion that too often follows young black teenagers, Carver radioed in that a possible theft was in progress. Within 90 seconds, 2 more officers arrived. Witnesses later testified that Elena never even heard the shouts aimed at her back. She couldn't. Born profoundly deaf, the commands carried no meaning as she adjusted her backpack and walked toward the library's front steps. When she reached in to retrieve her tablet, eager to show her mentor her new design, the officers saw only a quick movement of her arm. To them, it looked like a threat. In less than 4 seconds, 3 guns were drawn. 4 shots rang out. The library plaza erupted into chaos. Helen Carter, a retired school teacher who had been sitting on the bench waiting for her grandson, fumbled for her phone and managed to record the scene. Jason Miller, a law student at Emory University, had been studying inside. He ran to the window, then outside, pulling his phone into a shaky live stream that would soon be shared thousands of times across social media. Their videos revealed not just the shooting, but the silence that followed Elena's body on the cold steps, the tablet clattering beside her, its screen still glowing with lines of code. This was not the first time Atlanta had been forced to confront questions about race and policing. For older residents, the tragedy echoed the long history of the city, once the heart of the civil rights movement. It was hard not to draw comparisons to other national cases that had captured headlines in recent years. Tamir Rice, a 12-year-old boy in Cleveland, shot for holding a toy gun. Stefan Clark in Sacramento, gunned down in his grandmother's backyard while holding a cell phone. Each case followed a painful pattern: an ordinary object mistaken for a weapon, a black life lost or forever changed, and a community left asking how many times it would take before something changed. What struck many about Elena's story was not only her age, but her vulnerability. Being deaf meant she could not have complied with shouted orders, even if she had wanted to. Yet this reality was invisible in those crucial seconds. The truth is that most police departments in America still lack proper training for interacting with people who have disabilities. Studies show that individuals with hearing impairments face a significantly higher risk in encounters with law enforcement simply because communication breaks down. What for one person is an instinctive response to reach for a phone, a tablet, or a wallet can appear to an officer as a deadly threat. In Atlanta, a city proud of its role in advancing civil rights, the image of a deaf black teenager bleeding on the steps of its public library was a wound to its conscience. Parents whispered to their children about how to stay safe. Community leaders condemned what they saw as another example of systemic bias. And yet others rushed to defend the officers, insisting they had only followed their training. This division revealed the deeper problem: when fear and prejudice combine, no amount of procedure is enough to protect the innocent. The lesson from that day is sobering. Technology can bridge gaps, but it cannot fix the reflexes of a system conditioned to see threat before humanity. Elena's tablet was not a weapon. It was her voice, her future, her way of ensuring others like her would never be misunderstood. And yet, in those seconds, it became the very reason she was targeted. That irony struck hard for those who watched the footage replayed again and again on television screens. As Elena was rushed into an ambulance, Atlanta itself seemed to pause. People held their breath, wondering if she would survive. And just a few blocks away, Richard Brooks. Her father looked down at his phone. The custom alert he had programmed into her smartwatch had been triggered: elevated heart rate, then a sudden drop, coordinates flashing red. In that moment, his training from years in government service fused with the primal fear of a parent. Richard grabbed his keys, his mind already racing ahead to scenarios, threats, and strategies. He did not yet know that his journey to the library would mark the beginning of a fight far larger than any he had faced before. Every story has a turning point, and for the Brooks family, it came in those brief minutes between the shots outside the library and the pounding footsteps of a father racing toward his child. What happened next was not just the struggle of one man to protect his daughter. It became a confrontation with an entire system, a system that many had long suspected was broken, but few had dared to challenge directly. The question hanging in the air was simple yet terrifying. Would this father stop at seeking justice, or would he dare to dismantle the very institution that had harmed his child? And so, as the sirens faded into the distance and the library steps were cordoned off with yellow tape, Atlanta braced itself. A city with a history of both pain and progress was about to witness what happens when a father's love collides with systemic injustice. Part 2 begins with that moment, Richard Brooks arriving at the hospital doors, demanding answers, and vowing that what happened to Elena would not be buried under excuses and bureaucracy. It was the oath of a father, and it was about to change everything. Richard Brooks had seen crises before. During his years working in counterterrorism for the Pentagon, he had walked into rooms filled with panic with lives depending on his calm judgment. But nothing compared to the image that met him as he reached the emergency bay of Grady Memorial Hospital in downtown Atlanta. Paramedics were pushing his daughter Elena down the hall on a stretcher. Her blue dress was soaked through her body, dwarfed by machines and tubes. The father in him wanted to break down. The professional in him forced his voice steady as he declared, "I'm her father. I'm going with her." Yet within seconds, he hit the first wall of silence. A uniformed officer blocked his way, insisting he wait in the family room until the scene was secured. That phrase would haunt him. The scene. His child was not a scene. She was fighting for her life, and already the machine of official procedure was moving to keep him at a distance. Richard pulled out his government identification credentials. He rarely showed anyone since retiring. The young officer's eyes widened and reluctantly stepped aside. But the message was clear. From the very first moment, the police department's priority was to control the narrative, not to care for a wounded child. Inside the waiting area, Richard's mind was flooded with memories. He thought of the mornings he had walked Elena to school, the special hand signals they had invented that no one else understood, the Sunday pancakes, where she laughed at his lopsided attempts at hearts and stars. He thought of his late wife Angela, who had passed when Elena was just 10. Before her death, she had pressed his hand and whispered, "Protect her, Richard. This world won't make it easy." Those words now echoed like a commandment. The first hour at the hospital taught Richard something he already suspected: information would not come freely. Doctors were rushed, nurses tight-lipped, and every time he asked about his daughter's condition, someone reminded him that police investigators had to coordinate statements. He finally found a genuine ally in Dr. Sophia Martinez, the trauma surgeon working on Elena. In the middle of her chaotic shift, she looked him in the eyes and said, "She's stable for now, but it's critical. And Mr. Brooks, you should know, officers have already requested access to question her once she's conscious. I told them no, at least for the next 12 hours. Her courage to put medical necessity above police demands gave Richard a spark of hope. But outside her operating room, the wall was building higher. Chief Walter Briggs himself arrived, flanked by senior officers. Tall, silver-haired, with a politician's practiced smile, Briggs spoke as if offering condolences. "This is a tragedy for everyone," he said smoothly. But let's not make assumptions until we have all the facts. Richard's jaw tightened. He knew that language. It was the same script he had seen used overseas after botched Operation Stall Control and rewrite the record before truth takes root. This was not paranoia. American history had shown over and over how quickly stories of police shootings were massaged. In Ferguson, Missouri, Michael Brown was first painted as a threat rather than a teenager walking home. In Louisville, Kentucky, Breonna Taylor was described in official statements as collateral in a dangerous raid, her humanity reduced to a line item. Families often learned of their loved ones' deaths through the news, not from the authorities directly responsible. Richard recognized the signs. Atlanta's establishment would try to turn Elena's shooting into an unfortunate misunderstanding, burying the details that mattered most, that she was deaf, unarmed, and holding nothing more threatening than a tablet. As he sat in the fluorescent-lit waiting room, Richard noticed the subtle tactics already at play. Two officers positioned themselves by the entrance, claiming they were there for security. A plainclothes detective tried to casually ask him about Elena's habits, whether she had friends involved with trouble. Each question was a fishing expedition designed to plant seeds of doubt. Richard's training told him to remain calm, to say little, and to observe everything. So he did. He noted badge numbers, memorized faces, and filed each detail away. He knew the battle was only beginning. Meanwhile, outside the hospital, the community was stirring. Word spread quickly, thanks in part to Jason Miller's live stream, which had already circulated on social media. By nightfall, dozens of people gathered on the sidewalk, holding candles, whispering prayers. Some carried homemade signs, "Justice for Elena," and "She was deaf, not dangerous." Richard saw them briefly when he stepped outside to catch his breath. The sight of strangers standing vigil for his daughter filled him with both gratitude and sorrow. These people understood something the system seemed eager to erase: Elena's humanity. Inside, a different kind of pressure was mounting. Reporters crowded near the lobby, eager for quotes. Richard overheard snippets from police spokespersons framing the event as a tense encounter with a non-compliant suspect. Those words hit him like daggers. Non-compliant. How could a deaf girl comply with shouted orders she couldn't hear? He realized then that if he didn't take control of the narrative, someone else would twist it beyond recognition. The first wall of silence was not just the officers physically barring his path. It was the entire machinery of officialdom, legal, medical, political, moving swiftly to contain the damage. The mistake many families made in moments like this was trusting the process, believing that truth would surface on its own. Richard knew better. In his years with the Pentagon, he had seen intelligence-buried reports altered and lives destroyed by silence. Systems did not change out of conscience. They changed when forced. The lesson for anyone watching this story unfold is clear silence is rarely neutral. When institutions close ranks, their silence protects power, not people. For Richard, understanding this was both painful and liberating. It meant that he could not afford to be passive. Every second he hesitated was another chance for evidence to vanish, for witnesses to be intimidated, for Elena's story to be rewritten. As the night deepened, Richard finally stood in the ICU doorway. Elena lay pale but alive machines humming steadily at her side. He signed the words she loved most, I love you. Stay strong. Her eyelids fluttered, and though she could not respond fully, he saw the faint movement of her fingers, a whisper of acknowledgement. That was all it took. In that moment, Richard swore silently that he would not let her suffering become another statistic. He would uncover the truth, not just for her, but for every family who had been told to wait quietly for justice that never came. What began as a father's desperate plea was transforming into a vow. Richard Brooks, once a quiet consultant, was now a man on a mission. The wall of silence would not hold against him. He had skills, experience, and a community ready to rally if given direction. The question was no longer whether he would fight, but how far he was willing to go. And so, as dawn approached, and Elena rested under guarded care, Richard began planning. He would need allies. He would need evidence. And most of all, he would need to expose not just the officers who pulled the trigger, but the system that trained them to see his daughter as a threat. That path stepping beyond grief into action marks the beginning of Part 3, where Richard uncovers the hidden architecture of corruption that lay beneath the surface of his city. Richard Brooks did not sleep much in those first nights after the shooting. While Elena lay in the intensive care unit, her body fragile but breathing, he sat at the small desk in his apartment, the glow of multiple computer screens lighting his face. To the outside world, he looked like a father keeping vigil. In reality, Richard was beginning the work he knew better than anyone else, following digital trails, peeling back layers of secrecy, and mapping the system that had almost taken his daughter's life. What he found in those long hours was not a simple story of 3 reckless officers. It was a blueprint, a carefully constructed architecture of power and corruption that reached deep into the city's institutions. The first clue came when he used old backdoor programs from his Pentagon days to access internal police files. Buried in routine reports were references to focus zones, coded neighborhoods, flagged for heightened enforcement. On paper, it sounded like a strategy to keep the city safe. But when Richard cross-referenced the data, the truth became obvious. Every one of those focus zones overlapped with predominantly black communities. It was not safety they were targeting. It was people. This discovery explained something Richard had experienced himself. Since moving to Atlanta, he had been stopped multiple times without reason, asked where he was going or why he was in certain neighborhoods. At the time, he brushed it off as profiling, frustrating, but common. Now he understood that it wasn't random at all, it was policy. Officers were rewarded for high stop-and-search numbers in these zones, and residents were quietly funneled into the system on minor infractions. The pattern was chilling. More stops meant more arrests. More arrests meant more revenue for the city through fines, and ultimately more bodies in privately run prisons. The name South Core Corrections kept appearing in the documents Richard uncovered. On the surface, it was just a private company managing correctional facilities in Georgia. But financial records told a darker story. Campaign contributions flowed from South Core to the city's mayor, Robert Langford. Contracts funneled money back to the police department, in the form of training grants and equipment upgrades. In exchange, the department delivered a steady supply of prisoners disproportionately from black neighborhoods. It was a self-sustaining machine, one in which Elena's shooting was not an accident, but an inevitable outcome. History offered plenty of reminders that this was not new. In the late 1990s, a similar scandal in Louisiana revealed that private prisons lobbied for harsher sentencing laws to keep their beds filled. In Mississippi, judges were caught accepting bribes to send children to detention centers run by corporations. And across the country, reports showed how minority communities bore the brunt of broken windows, policing, and stop and frisk policies. Richard realized he was staring at Atlanta's version of the same story, only better hidden, cloaked in modern technology and legal jargon. The lesson was clear: corruption does not always announce itself with dramatic crimes. More often, it is written into policy, disguised as procedure, and reinforced by money quietly changing hands. For ordinary citizens, it becomes almost invisible. And that invisibility is the true danger. Without someone to connect the dots, the system continues unchecked, convincing communities that what they suffer is just the way things are. In his search for allies, Richard reached out cautiously. One of the first to respond was Detective Valerie Owens, a veteran of internal affairs. For 2 decades, she had filed reports, investigated complaints, and watched them disappear into locked drawers. She told him of cases where body camera footage conveniently went missing, or where excessive force complaints were labeled unsubstantiated despite multiple witnesses. "You're not imagining it," she said quietly when they met in the basement of Ebenezer Baptist Church. "The system isn't broken, Richard. It's working exactly as it was designed." Those words carried weight. Ebenezer Baptist, where Reverend Charles Hamilton offered his sanctuary, had long been a symbol of resistance. It was the same church where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once preached. To sit in its basement, surrounded by flickering monitors and stacks of files, gave Richard a sense of history pressing in on him. The fight for justice in Atlanta had never been abstract. It was generations old. And now his daughter's name was part of that legacy. Richard also connected with people outside law enforcement. Dr. Sophia Martinez provided medical documentation of Elena's injuries, confirming that the shots entered from behind evidence that she had not been facing the officers as they claimed. Jason Miller, the law student, began compiling legal research on previous cases of misconduct in the department. And Helen Carter, the retired teacher who had filmed the shooting, revealed she had also been documenting years of harassment of black teenagers at the library. Each piece of testimony fit into Richard's growing map of corruption. The deeper he dug, the clearer the pattern became. Officers like Brent Carver, the one who called in Elena as a suspect, had long lists of complaints filed against them. None had resulted in discipline. Supervisors routinely altered reports, ensuring that language like non-compliant suspect or threatening movement appeared in every file. This wording was not accidental. It was training. Officers were coached to describe encounters in ways that justified escalation, even when no threat existed. The result was a paper trail that protected them from accountability and made it nearly impossible for families to prove misconduct in court. At one point, Richard paused, staring at the growing web of names, numbers, and connections on his screen. It looked less like a series of mistakes and more like a machine. Every cog, police officers, city officials, prison contractors worked together intentionally or not to keep the system running. And Elena, with her tablet and her ideas, had become a disruption to that machine. That was why they treated her as a threat. She represented a different way forward, one where technology could prevent the misunderstandings they relied on to justify their force. For Richard, the realization was painful but clarifying. He could not fight this battle by appealing to sympathy alone. He needed to expose the structure to make the public see not just what happened to his daughter, but why it was almost destined to happen. The blueprint of corruption was his most powerful weapon, because once the design was visible, it could no longer be ignored. The small lesson in this part of the story is simple. When you face injustice, never stop at the surface. Dig deeper. Ask not just who pulled the trigger, but who built the system that made the trigger inevitable. For Richard, that perspective turned grief into strategy. As the days passed, his operation grew more organized. Allies met in the church basement. Files were uploaded to secure servers, and encrypted messages flowed between phones late into the night. Each new discovery fueled his determination. Yet Richard knew that uncovering the blueprint was only half the battle. The next step would be far riskier, turning the system against itself, using its own secrets to bring it crashing down. That turning point, when investigation became action. Richard Brooks had always believed that information was power. In his years with the Pentagon, he had learned that battles were not only won with weapons, but with intelligence, knowing where the cracks in the enemy's armor lay, anticipating movements, and shining light into the darkest corners. Sitting in the basement of Ebenezer Baptist Church, surrounded by flickering monitors and allies who believed in his daughter's innocence, Richard gave their mission a name: Operation Iron Lantern. It would be the light that pierced the shadows of corruption, a beacon strong enough to turn the system against itself. The first step was to gather testimony that couldn't be erased. Richard understood that official records could be tampered with, body cameras could fail, and reports could be rewritten. But the voices of people who had seen the truth, if protected and preserved, could not be so easily silenced. He worked with Jason Miller, the law student, to draft affidavits for witnesses like Helen Carter, the retired teacher, and Dr. Sophia Martinez, who had first-hand knowledge of Elena's injuries. Their statements were uploaded to encrypted servers and stored in multiple locations. This way, even if someone tried to destroy evidence, copies would survive. Detective Valerie Owens played a crucial role. Still serving within the Atlanta Police Department, she risked her career by slipping Richard information from internal meetings. She revealed that Chief Briggs was already instructing officers to synchronize narratives and to emphasize Elena's non-compliance in their reports. Owens recorded snippets of these instructions, proof that the cover-up was not an accident, but a coordinated effort. Her bravery reminded Richard that corruption was never absolute. There were always individuals inside who felt the weight of conscience. The turning point came when Richard made contact with Ethan Price, one of the three officers who had fired that day. Ethan was younger, only 3 years into the force, and unlike Carver or Sullivan, he had not yet hardened himself against doubt. Richard approached him carefully, not with threats, but with empathy. In a quiet meeting at a diner outside the city, Richard asked him directly, "When you pulled that trigger, what did you see?" Ethan's hands trembled around his coffee cup. "I saw a girl," he whispered, "but I saw the others draw first. I didn't want to be the one who froze." That moment of confession cracked something open. Ethan agreed to wear a recording device to the next department meeting. The evidence he captured was explosive. Chief Briggs, unaware of the wire, spoke freely. The body cameras failed. "That's the story. Reports go in tonight. I don't want discrepancies. Use the template I sent." Subject appeared to reach for a weapon. "Say it exactly like that." His words revealed not only manipulation, but deliberate coaching of false testimony. For Richard and his team, it was the smoking gun that proved the corruption went all the way to the top. But exposing the truth was not as simple as releasing a file online. Richard had watched in other cities how quickly officials dismissed or discredited videos, framing them as out of context. He knew that if he acted too early, the department would regroup and paint him as a radical father lashing out in grief. Timing mattered. The plan became clear: build the case slowly, layer by layer, until the structure was so undeniable that it collapsed under its own weight. Outside of their secret meetings, the city was growing restless. Vigils turned into marches. Hundreds gathered in front of Atlanta City Hall, with signs demanding justice for Elena. Chants of "she was deaf, not dangerous" echoed across downtown. National reporters began arriving, sensing a story too large to ignore. The more the community spoke out, the more pressure mounted. Yet, with pressure came danger. Helen Carter's home was vandalized with spray paint warning her to stay quiet. Jason received anonymous emails telling him to stop helping that hacker father. Even Dr. Martinez was visited by plainclothes officers who questioned her loyalty. Richard reminded them all of the lesson he had carried for years. Intimidation is the last tool of a collapsing system. The louder the threats, the closer they were to the truth. To make sense of it for his team, Richard explained through an example. "Think about a chessboard," he said one night as they huddled in the basement. "If you move too quickly, you expose your queen. If you move too slowly, the opponent builds defenses. The key is patience, waiting until every piece is aligned. Then one move brings the whole board down." They nodded, understanding that their operation wasn't about revenge, but about precision. For everyday people following the story, the lesson was simpler. When facing injustice, patience and preparation are as important as passion. Anger may ignite change, but strategy sustains it. Richard's approach showed that emotional strength, combined with careful planning, could dismantle even the most entrenched structures of power. As weeks passed, Operation Iron Lantern expanded. Richard's old contacts in cybersecurity helped secure additional channels. Volunteers from the community rotated shifts outside Elena's hospital room to ensure she remained safe. Reverend Hamilton used his pulpit to rally support, reminding the congregation that faith without action was hollow. And slowly, the case built momentum beyond Atlanta. Civil rights organizations from across the country reached out offering legal teams and media connections. What began as one father's vow was becoming a movement. Still, Richard knew that corruption would not yield without resistance. The police department struck back, releasing edited clips to the media that painted Elena as suspicious. Local news ran segments questioning Richard's background, hinting at radical associations from his Pentagon days. It was a tactic as old as time discredit the accuser to protect the accused. But Richard countered by releasing his own carefully curated evidence to trusted journalists. One article in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution exposed the focus zones and their targeting of black neighborhoods, complete with charts and testimony. The balance of public opinion began to shift. The hardest moment came late one night when Richard sat beside Elena's hospital bed. Her eyes fluttered open, and though weak, she signed slowly. Why me? Richard's chest ached. He wanted to tell her it was a mistake, but he knew better. Instead, he signed back, because you matter, because your voice is powerful. That exchange reminded him that Operation Iron Lantern was not just about exposing corruption. It was about ensuring that Elena and others like her could live without fear of being silenced by the very people sworn to protect them. By the end of the fourth week, Richard and his allies were ready. They had maps of corruption recordings, of conspiracy testimony from witnesses, and growing national attention. The system was tightening its grip, but in doing so, it revealed its weakness. Richard looked around the basement at the faces of those who had risked everything to stand beside him and knew the time had come. Operation Iron Lantern had been about preparation, patience, and protection. Now, it would move into its final phase exposure. The city of Atlanta was about to see not just the story of one girl and her father, but the unraveling of an entire structure of power. And as Richard prepared for that decisive step, Part 5 begins the transformation from blood on the library steps to the rebuilding of a city forced to confront its own conscience. The day the evidence was released, Atlanta stopped holding its breath. Files that Richard Brooks and his allies had preserved for weeks appeared simultaneously in the inboxes of federal investigators, national journalists, and civil rights organizations. The recordings of Chief Briggs instructing his officers to alter reports, the proof of targeted focus zones, the financial connections to South Core corrections, it all became public. For years, whispers of corruption had floated through the city. Now people saw it laid bare. What had begun as blood on the library steps was transforming into a bridge towards something different. Elena's story carried the deepest weight. Seeing her fragile frame on the hospital steps, clutching a tablet rather than a weapon, reminded people across the country that injustice often falls on the most vulnerable. Her app, Bridgecom, once just a school project, gained statewide attention. With the support of universities and advocacy groups, it was developed into a tool used in pilot programs with police departments. The irony was not lost. The very device mistaken for a threat became the technology guiding safer encounters. The city of Atlanta faced a reckoning. Briggs resigned in disgrace, several officers were indicted, and Mayor Langford's political career crumbled under federal investigation. But perhaps more important than the headlines was what happened in neighborhoods once marked as zones. Community meetings flourished in church basements. Local leaders demanded oversight boards with real authority. For the first time in decades, residents felt they had a say in how safety was defined, not imposed. It was slow, imperfect work, but it was change rooted in lived experience. History offered parallels. After Rodney King's beating in Los Angeles, reforms eventually reshaped training and oversight, though not without setbacks. After George Floyd's murder, Minneapolis ignited a national conversation about systemic reform. And now, Atlanta added its name to that lineage, not because one politician decreed it, but because a father refused to stay silent. Richard's greatest accomplishment was not only dismantling corruption, but showing his neighbors that they could demand better. The lesson here is simple, but powerful systems resist change until they are forced into the light. One person's persistence can spark a chain reaction, but it takes a community to turn that spark into lasting fire. Richard's oath to his daughter became a shared promise never again to accept silence as justice. Months later, Elena returned to school. She walked with a limp, but her spirit carried the weight of something larger than pain. Friends greeted her, not with pity, but with admiration, some even learning sign language to speak with her more easily. She had become a symbol, not of tragedy, but of possibility. As you reflect on this story, ask yourself, what bridges can we build in our own communities so no child has to face what Elena did? If you believe stories like this matter, stories of resilience, truth, and transformation, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Together, we can keep shining a light on the stories others would rather keep in the dark.